This is chapter 13.2, Settling on the Great Plains. So we've already started to discuss how many of these settlers are moving westward and are coming into conflict with many Native Americans. Well, one single thing that sort of completes and allows for rapid growth, or many settlers moving west, is the Transcontinental Railway. So the completion of this transcontinental railway, it's going to quickly lead to more and more people being able to settle in the West. There are two companies with the Transcontinental Railway. There is the Central Pacific, which is moving east from Sacramento, and we have the Union Pacific, which is moving west from Omaha. So we have two different companies moving from different directions to meet each other in Utah. These companies, they end up selling their extra land to people for farms. And many of the people who would buy the land from these companies, Union Pacific and Central Pacific, they were immigrants. So we're seeing an influx or a growth of more immigrants coming to the Great Plains. Now, if we're to think of it, here is Sacramento. The red one is going all the way here. And here is the Union Pacific that's going from Omaha. Okay, so if you can imagine, you can now take a train across most of the U.S., leading to more settling. Now, it's important to note that most of the labor done on these railroads were done by people who were in poverty. So we have Chinese immigrants who end up working on the railway for a long time, African Americans, who are sort of escaping from the Southern economy after Reconstruction and violence in the KKK. And we have Civil War vets. So many people who were Civil War vets, they didn't really have a livelihood to go back to after the Civil War, and they needed the money. So these are the type of people who are creating the railway across the country, okay? Another reason why many people are moving westward is the Homestead Act. So Congress offers 160 acres of land to families. So by 1862 to 1900, we have over 600,000 families moving into the Great Plains area. Many of the types of people who are leaving are ones who need sort of a new opportunity. We've discussed this before. We have the exodusers. These are African Americans who are looking for a new life after the Reconstruction period. So we left the end of the Reconstruction, many African Americans were still being treated horribly in the South. So these are the type of people who are going to move with their family across the country to try and gain land. But the reality of the Homestead Act is that only 10% of the land that was given was actually used by families. So we are having people who are looking to start businesses and corporations. They're the ones who are actually taking a lot of this land. The other thing about the Homestead Act is the type of land that was being given. Now, 160 acres sounds wonderful to a farmer in the South. But the reality of the land is that some is not going to be valuable. There's going to be, if you have 160 acres of land that is desert, you're not really going to be able to produce anything off of it. So that ends up causing some tension as some people are getting 160 acres of farmable land versus 160 acres of desert and mountains. Here's an example of some of the places that they're living. So this is an example of a pioneer. They're sort of moving across west. And these are the types of places that they're living in. We would call these dugouts or soddies. Here is an example of African American pioneers starting to move westward as well. So they're sort of on the road. And here they've already sort of established their place. Now, the closing of the frontier. Now, the frontier is this idea of manifest destiny and land that is sort of untouched by any sort of settler. Washburn and Langford, they are starting to get worried about this untouched wilderness. There's so many settlers moving west, taking up land and sort of destroying trees to make way for farms, that the Yellowstone National Park, they're one of the first national parks to be declared an area where people are not allowed to settle. This is an example of Yellowstone National Park. Now, if you ever get a chance to go there, it is absolutely gorgeous. Okay, so this is a huge waterfall in that area. In 1890, we have the declaration that the frontier no longer exists. Now, what that means is that frontier is this idea of wilderness, untouched, only Native Americans live there. That's no longer exists. That means people have settled so much in the West that there is no longer this idea of untouched land. Number 2, settlers meet challenges on the plains. So some of the challenges that settlers meet is we discussed last week about conflicts with natives, but there's some other sort of everyday challenges that they have. One being dugouts. So there are no trees in the Great Plains. So people don't really have the typical materials to build a house. So they end up digging houses in the side of hills as a way to have protection. We also have a soddy. Now, a soddy is a freestanding house with a lot of prairie grass as its covering. So they'd actually create sort of a hill, a grassy house hill, okay? Here's an example of a dugout. So as you can see, they're actually digging into a hill. They're digging into a house. Here's an example of a soddy. And this is an actual real example of a dugout house. Now, the women in the Great Plains, they are basically treated like men. So they need every type of laborer in the Great Plains. There is no longer slavery. There is not a lot of people to work on your 160 acres. The only people you can rely on is your own family. So women played an important role. They were a part of the work and labor force. They also were the ones who often started churches and schools in the Great Plains area as well. Another thing that we start to see is new technology being developed. So again, 160 acres of land is a lot of land for one family. And it becomes a little bit too much to handle. But in the end of the 1800s, we have so because of the Industrial Revolution, we have new machines are produced, such as the steel plow. So we have John Deere, he makes the steel plow in the late 1800s. This allows for farming to be much an easier task in the Great Plains area. So a lot of new technology ends up leading to more food. Now, agricultural education is another thing that becomes important in this area. So the Morrill Act, this is when the federal government gives states money and land to start colleges that are focused on farming. So the federal government realizes that the Great Plains has the potential to be a great place to produce a lot of food for the rest of America. So they're giving money to make sure that the food that's being produced on the Great Plains is efficient and a lot of it. So these colleges, it leads to more technology for farming, and it also leads to many people understanding how to properly farm. That is why the Great Plains area is now called, and is still called, the breadbasket of the nation. So because of the Morrill Act and more education in farming, this area of the U.S. is able to produce a lot of food. Now machines, they end up being expensive. So many of these small farms, the ones that are 160 acres, they aren't really able to afford these machines. So smaller farms, they couldn't make it, so they end up being bought out by larger farms or bonanza farms. And it sort of shifts where this area is no longer small farms producing food for the nation, but larger corporate farms. So here is this example of bonanza farms. As you can see, some of these machines are going through the wheat. Your question for this week is, what were some of the things that the government did to help rapidly spread settlement in the Great Plains area? So list a few things that the government did.